Sometimes coming up with the introductions to these videos can be the most difficult part. Just trying to figure out where to start, what to lead with, etc. And I'm going to be honest, with recent current events and the holidays coming up, I'm probably even less focused than usual. So in an attempt to try to get my mind off of the absolute state of things, just insert a British accent on that last bit, I'm not even going to try to attempt it, I picked a game this week that, unlike a lot of other recent games that I've reviewed, I actually have history with, and not just seeing the game in electronics boutique catalogs or on the shelf at Blockbuster. No, in this case I've actually played this one before, due to the fact that when it was originally released, one of my friends that also had a Sega Genesis at the time had a copy of it, and I was able to play it a few times when I was over visiting before soccer practice. I thought that might be a good way to remember how things were way back when, during a time before I had any concerns about who the leader of the free world might be. What a concept. Anyway, Electronic Arts these days is probably most well known for its major sports titles, and the occasional franchise like Dragon Age or Dead Space, but back in the day, they published all sorts of titles. A lot of this diversity came from pre-existing games that they were able to get ported to the Genesis from home computers, with games that originated on the Amiga or Atari ST being prime candidates for porting due to the fact that both of those were based around the Motorola 68000 processor architecture, just like the Genesis. With both of those home computer families enjoying the majority of their success in Europe, you probably wouldn't be too surprised for one of these games to have some decidedly British inspiration, and what's more British than Ian Fleming's own James Bond? And fish. However, I probably should pause for a second because I'm sure that there's some of you out there that don't know me and are now mad because I used a picture of Roger Moore instead of Sean Connery when mentioning James Bond. And to that, I say just be glad that I didn't use George Lazenby because no one likes him. Hi, my name is Dave, and welcome to Zilog and Moto, the channel where, when I'm trying not to annoy middle-aged spy movie fans, I'm out to collect and review the nearly 1,280 titles released in the English language for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega or Mega CD as the case may be, and finally the 32X. Basically, if I can plug it into a Genesis, either by itself or with some sort of add-on, and be able to read what's up on the screen, I'm trying to get a copy of it and review it for posterity, with both looks at that original packaging and gameplay captured from original hardware whenever possible. James Bond definitely appeared to be an unusual game. It seemed like nothing like the majority of the games on the Genesis that I was familiar with when it was released in April of 1991, which makes sense because most games I knew at the time tended to be either sports titles or games that had been developed in Japan. Of course, I didn't know why at the time, but this is because James Bond is one of those Electronic Arts ports that I was talking about that originated in Europe, as it was developed by what was then Millennium Interactive, and they were based in the UK in Cambridge. The game made its actual debut in 1990 on the aforementioned Amiga and Atari ST, and was apparently well received enough that Electronic Arts decided to take a chance on it and picked it up for what would be only their 8th release on the console at that point. So how does James Bond fare on a console? Is it a fun experience that thrives from its diversity? Or is it a game that probably should have stayed on home computers? Well, we'll take a look at all of that, but first, a look at this cardboard package. And here's my copy of James Bond for the Genesis. You'll immediately notice that this copy is not in pristine shape, and unfortunately that carries on to the manual and cartridge as well. More on them in a minute. Many of these older Electronic Arts games tend to be somewhat beat up, at least from a packaging perspective, because of this cardboard packaging that they used, as to not rely on Sega for clamshells. If you've never seen one, they're constructed similar to the early Sega CD boxes, which also tend to be somewhat destroyed these days as a rule. Honestly, it could be a lot worse, so I'll probably stick with this copy and maybe just switch out the cartridge at some point for one with a better label. But if you want to find one for yourself in similar condition, they are regularly available on eBay for just $20 or so, and then on up depending on condition. As far as the cover art goes, this is using that original Electronic Arts half and half formatting with the art in the top and the logo at the bottom. And while I don't think that always works since you lose a lot of space, here I like it, as the graphics and logo look good on the background. The art features James in a pose that evokes some of the artwork used when promoting the movie From Russia with Love, if the pun inherent in the name wasn't enough for you. There was no Japanese release for the game, like with many other Electronic Arts titles, but the European release saw the cover art modified a bit, with it taking up the entire cover. But I'll be honest, even though it's larger, I don't really like how everything was recomposited. It just seems sloppier. I think they got this one right the first time with the Amiga and Atari ST versions. Flipping over the back, and I really like this layout, especially when you consider how simple many of the layouts were at the time. It's really eye-catching, and of course the film strip approach plays up the film parody aspect of the game. The screenshots are all of fantastic quality, and while there's going to be some similarities due to the blue background, they still manage to show off color and detail in the levels, each complete with captions that refer to the levels that the shots are from. I also like the ID card in the top corner, which refers to Pond's birthplace as Wales, which is perfectly in line with the rest of the, at times, groan-inducing humor in the game. And of course there's the ending stinger to the flavor text on the back. He's fearless, he's daring, he's ozone-friendly. And at first that might seem a little strange, but it makes sense when you get that the overall plot is that being a fish, the missions that he's on are trying to fight back against evil polluters and other dangers to the environment, which was, of course, a big topic at the time. When you open the box, you've got the manual and cartridge, and you can see what I meant when I said the cartridge needed a label upgrade. And the manual, in a strange development, is completely missing its staples. Thankfully, all the pages are intact, but I don't know what happened here. If this was just a printing defect, or if the previous owner removed them, because the holes are there. Could be they were getting rusty, which is ironic for this title. The manual is pretty standard fare, but it does hit all of the stuff that you would want to have in a manual, like explaining each of the 12 levels, the various power-ups, the enemies that you'll run into, and even how these secret rooms work. I also have to call out the beginning of the manual that focuses on designer Chris Sorrell, who somehow managed to come up with all of the art in the game at 18, which is pretty remarkable, and then has gone on to have a long career in the industry, being one of the main figures behind the Medieval series. So if you see some familiarity in between those games and James Pond, well, now you know why. Okay, that's the package. Let's see if we can save the world one flipper at a time. I mentioned in the intro that I'd played James Pond before, but I'll be honest, that was like almost 35 years ago now, and I really don't remember much about it, other than it was a platformer, and I don't think I ever made it very far due to having limited time with the game. So even though I had a previous dalliance with it, playing it for the review was a mostly new experience, and completely new for some of the levels that I made it to this time that I never saw back in the day. The memories from before are pretty hazy at this point. I mean, I have issues remembering what I did last week, much less 35 years ago, which might as well have been a previous lifetime at this point. However, it didn't take me long to remember why I never beat it, as there's some brutal difficulty increases once you get about halfway through the game. I've got a feeling that there's probably not very many people out there that managed to beat this one honestly, and that's probably part of why the game isn't more valuable. I mean, why would you want to spend a bunch of money on something to just have a painful, torturous experience? You know what? I'm stopping that line of thinking right there. You can fill in the blanks. Anyway, this is all getting ahead of myself. I should probably back up and introduce the game properly. As mentioned, James Pond Underwater Agent, which is the full proper name of the game, not just James Pond, is a platforming action title originally released in 1990 for the Amiga and Atari ST, and then ported to the version that we're reviewing today on the Genesis in April of 1991. I'm going with both platforming and action genres there because while it's probably easiest to just throw it in the platforming bin, I don't think that it's really an accurate description of what you do in the game, especially since James is always carrying one of two different guns, and then for a majority of the game, you're not actually jumping on platforms because you're swimming in water. You know, because you're a fish. The game consists of 12 levels, with each having their names inspired by a James Bond film. For instance, there's For Your Fins Only, Leak and Let Die, A View to a Spill, and then the final showdown in Dr. Maybe, just to name a few. And no, the plots of the levels don't mirror the plots of the movies. It's not that deep a game. Deep. You get it. You see, I said deep, and it's a game where you spend most of your time diving into the You know what? Let's just move on. Even though the levels don't have anything to do with actual Bond plot lines, they do all have their own individual identities and goals, which helps keep the game from just feeling like you're doing the same thing 12 levels in a row. However, even though each of the levels has a different theme with different graphic elements to keep things interesting, the game really is made up of 3 types of levels: land fetch quests, water fetch quests, and escort quests. But in all of the levels, you're really just taking one thing from one place to another a set amount of times before the level exit opens, and then you can either keep going to get more points or move on. This is probably a good point to stop and mention that players that don't have the manual might get stuck on the second level. The first level falls into the water fetch quest category, and it's very simple because basically you're just going around the level collecting keys to open up lobster cages to free the lobsters before they're harvested. It's a nice warm-up and allows you to get a feel for the controls before getting into more intense action. However, the second level is different, as it's the first of the escort quest missions instead, where it's asking you to escort healthy fish out of polluted waters before they're mutated into some of the enemies that you see in the level. There's just one problem. If you're playing the game without the manual, there's no indication anywhere of where in the level you're supposed to escort the fish to. The level introduction screen just gives you the vague instructions of guide them to safety. But where is safety? My first time playing this level, I wandered around for probably 15 minutes trying to figure out what exactly it was I was supposed to do, just going back and forth between the 2 main areas of the level before giving up. Not exactly a great way for James Pond to leave a first impression. Eventually, I took a break and looked closer at the manual, and there the level description helpfully states that you need to lead the fish back to the entrance pipe. Now, I suppose players probably could have figured this one out on their own given enough time, but I have to wonder how many people possibly rented the game, didn't have the manual, and never got past the second level. I mean, how hard would it have been to just modify the in-game level description to say, guide them to the entrance pipe where they can escape to safety, or something along those lines? It's a minor detail in the grand scheme of things, and I'm not going to ding the review score because of something that was covered in the manual, but it seems like something that probably should have come up in playtesting. The third level introduces the last type of level, the land fetch category. Now, when I say land fetch quests, what I really mean is that these are levels where you have to find something in the level and bring it up to the surface of the water, and then either drop it in a waiting boat or leave it on land for a local yob to pick it up. And I must say, I do appreciate the detail in the art of having them wear shirts that look similar to the Union Jack. In the case of the third level specifically, it's the type where you have to drop stuff on a boat, specifically gold bars. I like the concept for a level. I mean, who's better to go searching a pirate ship for sunken treasure than a fish? And the fact now that there's a third level in a row where you're doing something different. It's just good level design. I also appreciate the custom unkillable ghost pirate enemy to add danger while keeping with the pirate theme. And while he's unkillable, he's really not that dangerous. You just have to be careful about avoiding him and not running into other hazards along the way. However, what I don't appreciate is an enemy that's the other way around, and that's the jellyfish. In some levels, there's a jellyfish enemy that you can only see when you're wearing spy sunglasses, and if you can't see them, you apparently can't hit them with your bubble gun either, for reasons. Now, I actually like the idea that you have to go and search for various spy gear that allows you to do certain things. It makes it so that you actually have a reason to thoroughly explore the levels, and not just do the bare minimum to make it to the next. There's the aforementioned sunglasses, a top hat that allows you to take more damage, a fishbowl helmet that allows you to stay above water for longer, and finally a ray gun that instantly allows you to take out enemies rather than bubbling them first. Also, just as an aside, there's a note in the Sega Retro write-up that says the ray gun doesn't appear when played on North American consoles, and I'm not entirely sure what they're referring to there, maybe they mean if you're playing the European version on a Genesis, because the ray gun is definitely in the North American version of the game. Anyway, you might be confused because being able to find items to help you through the game is a good thing, right? Well, it is, except for in the case of the fetch missions. Apparently James can't carry one of the special items and then the item that he needs to fetch at the same time. And I don't get it. I mean, the ray gun, I suppose I can kind of understand, but he can't wear sunglasses and carry something at the same time? Or wear a hat and carry something? I understand that they were trying to add a bit of challenge or strategy, but the later levels are hard enough. This simply isn't necessary. One other design problem that I've got with the game is the extra life system. There's plenty of extra lives available if you look closely, and they're also fairly generous with awarding them via your score. But unfortunately, James can't have more than 4 at a time for some reason. This means that early in the game, when it's easier to save up lives, you can't, and you'll just end up wasting them. This is partially due to the life meter, which has James hold up a fish finger for each life that he has, and he only has 4 fingers. I get it, and I like the unique display. In fact, the entire status display at the bottom of the screen is very creative. But we're already assigning fingers to a fish. Was there really no way to tell players that they had more than 4 lives? At least the game has a continue system, so you do have a few chances if you lose all of your lives, but the end game is hard enough as is. Players really should have been able to bank more lives early on. It probably seems like I'm being somewhat critical of the game's design, but even with those flaws, there's lots of good ideas here. There's tons of different items to pick up, with some being beneficial and some being ones you want to avoid, so you can't just blindly pick up everything you see. Also, the game control is very simple, but effective, with players largely being able to just pick up and play the game, as most of the time you'll only be moving around and shooting your bubble gun. I think the only problem I had with controls was jumping on land, but considering how fish normally do out of the water, that's fair. And to mix things up, each level not only has just bonus areas, but hidden warp zones if you know where to look. Pipes, invisible bricks in the air that appear when you headbutt them, and warp zones? Clearly Chris Sorrell liked his Gianna sisters. Aside from just the physical level design, I really like the aesthetic that Chris went with as well. Everything has this nice, colorful, cartoony look to it, with the characters being drawn with big, round eyes. And as mentioned, each of the levels have distinct artistic elements to them, which helps keep the game fresh. There's plenty of different enemies that vary based on the level, and as mentioned, tons of different items to collect. And even if most of those are just for points, it still allows the game to have a variety that other platformers tend to lack. There's never any performance issues, and the game just zips around quickly, to the point to where you really have to be careful the later you progress not to move around too quickly and run into enemies, which by then can be an almost immediate death. The audio in James Pond is solid. I wouldn't say it's the best soundtrack that I've ever heard, but there's some clear quality to not just the musicianship, but also the specific synths that were used to produce the music. When listening to the soundtrack, I can just visualize in my head the songs being originally composed on the synthesizer. There's also some nice variety to the music as well. It's not just variations on the James Bond theme. And the bonus areas have different music than the main levels as well, so you won't find yourself listening to the same music for long periods of time. The sound effects match the music and are of equal quality, but definitely sound like they got their inspiration from the home computer demo scene, which is appropriate considering where this game came from. All in all, I think James Pond Underwater Agent is a decent but very flawed effort, with promise for potentially a better game and a sequel that maybe addresses some of the issues with its design. I definitely think it's worth playing, especially if you like platformers, just because of how unique it is. But don't go into it expecting to play a great game or one that you can finish without cheating. After struggling with some of the later levels, I put in the cheat code for invincibility just so I could see the whole game for myself, and it doesn't work exactly how you might think, and due to that, I still ended up dying on the last level. It's that chaotic. As a result, I'm giving James Pond Underwater Agent 2 stars. Had the game not been so ridiculously difficult towards the end, I think I definitely would have leaned towards at least 3 stars,
especially since it came out so relatively early in the console's lifespan, and it's only a 4 megabit game. But unfortunately, the game is just a bit too flawed for that.
And that's it for James Pond Underwater Agent for the Genesis. I'm glad I got to revisit this one as an adult because I was always curious about what happened later on in the game, and I couldn't remember why I didn't finish it before. Well, now I know. I would have been happier if I'd found out that I was just a stupid kid and there was actually a great game here that I simply didn't know enough to play properly at the time, but unfortunately that wasn't the case. I actually just had a similar experience with Halo as well. I played through it again for the first time in 20 years or so, and I remember the single player being super boring. And oh my, it is every bit as bad as I remembered. At least as multiplayer, I guess. Next time on the channel, it's a game that I always confused with another game growing up, but before the internet was really a thing and we could look those sorts of things up. You see, the name of the game for the US version is very similar to a very different arcade game from 1980. And I didn't realize that for a long time, and I thought the Genesis game was a port of that arcade title. And I was always confused because I would see screenshots for both games and they looked nothing alike. It wasn't until I heard people talking about the Mega Drive version of the game, which goes by another completely different name, that I realized the error of my ways. Well, whatever name you called it, I've never played it, so I'm pretty excited for what next week holds in store for that review. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto episode 260. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later!